There's a lot of theme of Connecticut today. So back when we started that church in Connecticut, there was a couple that came. It was an interesting couple, an Englishman and a Southern gal. And they came when it was about the same size as this church right now. They came, we were in a tiny little room in the courtyard by Marriott. And when they left, he was fully convinced we were a cult and wondered when the Kool-Aid was going to come out. But his wife graciously said, I'm pretty sure they're not. And so he agreed to come back, and then they were with us ever since. I'm going to invite Pastor Nicholas up as I continue to talk a little bit about him. So Pastor Nicholas is a chemistry professor at UConn, and yet he stuck with our team. He helped become an incredibly valuable part of our team, ended up becoming a pastor on the staff team, and did all of this. And he served so many hours, all as an unpaid staff member and maintaining his job, which he still holds as a chemistry professor at UConn. And Nicholas and Susan, we so appreciate you making the trip from Connecticut to come out here and be with us and encourage us in this. And so without further ado, you've got the mystery of the yellow car. Including me, we are all on the edge of our seats. But honestly, thank you for being here this morning. We appreciate you, and I'm going to get out of your way and let you at it. Let's give Nicholas and Susan a round of applause.
It's great to be here in Sarasota. It's the first time I've been on the Gulf Coast of Florida. Florida is hot. Yes, I've heard it even gets hotter than this. But I find that hard to believe. I'm surprised everybody's not saved here, because if hell is hot, then this is a taste of the heat. Ooh. But it's great to see Bill start up this church. It's great to meet a number of you, and I'm with you. I have that same pioneer spirit. I really believe that God can do remarkable things, and has done remarkable things in Connecticut, and will continue to do so there. And I believe that the same is true here. So when I was a student at college, I had a special pen box, and I would use one of the pens in it for an exam right from my first year, and I did really well in that exam. So I decided that that same pen should be used for every exam that I took, because I felt it was my lucky pen. But this is where it gets weird. Before each exam, to make it double lucky, I would douse the pen in cheap cologne. And so in the exam room, there was always this smell associated with the area in which I sat. And I kept this pen in my little pen box, and it would only ever come out at exam time. Well, I've matured since then in every sense of the word. And I don't believe there is such a thing as luck. We don't even have good or bad fortune. Everything happens for a reason. It's part of God's plan for our lives. God intertwines his story with our story. And while we might not know why things happen, they don't happen by surprise to God. And today we're going to look at a passage from the book of Esther. Specifically, we're going to be in chapter 6, which is a bit halfway through the book of Esther. Now, the book of Esther might not be one that we often encounter in the Bible. It's one of two books that are named after a woman. We have Esther and Ruth, both of which are real gems. And the book of Esther is really a story of how God works and how we all have purpose in life. Now, we all love a good story. That's what helps us keep hooked in movies, and the book of Esther is really an amazing story. But unlike a fictional novel or a film, it's a true story. It's a story of intrigue, of goodies and baddies, of greed and humility. And we're going to see that even though God doesn't get explicitly mentioned anywhere in the book of Esther, God's fingerprints are all over the story. But what we don't sometimes understand is that we're also part of the story God is writing. And it's an amazing story. God builds us and prepares us for our purpose. And all this is intentional. Nothing happens by accident. So in the book of Esther, we have the book's namesake, Esther, and she's a Jewish orphan girl. And she gets adopted by her uncle Mordecai. And she's living in the Persian Empire, which is ruled by King Xerxes. Now, he likes throwing parties, and lavish parties at that, to show his wealth and his status. And at one of them, he calls for his wife, Vashti, to come and parade herself. But she says, no, I'm not going. And the king is furious, and his advisors tell him he should get rid of her, and he does. Then the king wants to get a replacement, so he has a beauty pageant, and Esther catches his eye. Sort of like the ultimate bachelorette. She gets the rose, and he gets to pick her to be his wife. And while she gains favor with the king, there's this side plot going on. Because we have Haman, who is an evil guy, and he's super sneaky. And he goes from power to power in the king's palace, and everybody bows down to him, except one person. That's Mordecai, the Jew. And Haman doesn't understand why Mordecai won't bow down to him. And it really eats him up, and he gets fixated about it. And so he condemns all the Jews, and he convinces the king to put out a decree to eliminate all the Jews, including Mordecai. And Esther gets wind of this, and being Jewish herself, she wants to save her people, so she hatches a plan to do this. She thinks, I'm going to get the king all liquored up, and I'm going to tell him that I'm a Jew and that he can't kill all us Jews. And so she puts on this big feast, and she invites Haman to it. They have a great time. Haman leaves, and he sees Mordecai at the palace gate. And this is a trigger for Haman, and he throws a fit. Esther doesn't get a chance to sweet-talk the king. And so she says, well, I'm going to have another party tomorrow night. And I'm going to invite Haman again. And the king is all in for this. But Haman goes home to his wife. He says he just can't go because he's going to see Mordecai again. And Haman's wife, who is equally as despicable as Haman himself, has an idea. He says, let's get a big pole and let's impale Mordecai on this pole. So that's where we are when we go into chapter 6. And the first thing we're going to see in chapter 6 is a bit of insomnia. So let's read the first verse. Esther 6:1 says, that night the king could not sleep, so he ordered the book of the Chronicles, the record of his reign, to be brought in and read to him. So the king couldn't sleep. I don't know whether it was acid reflux from all the food he ate at the feast. We don't know. But the fact that he couldn't sleep is a pivotal thing. He decides he wants to read a book. And so he asks his attendants to get out the book of the Chronicles. This is sort of like a history book, which has all the things the kings of Persia have done in it. Maybe he wanted it because he felt it was so boring that it would put him to sleep. Or maybe he wanted to reminisce on the past. But it's sort of kind of like you looking at something on your phone in the middle of the night, hoping that eventually you'll fall back to sleep. This is a habit of something that I tend to do when I don't sleep. I see Susan grinning because she knows I do this. But sometimes it actually makes me worse. It keeps me up even longer because I get frustrated about something or annoyed about something. And actually, on a few occasions, I have fallen asleep. And I fall asleep clutching my phone. And woken up in the morning still clutching my phone. Anyway, what was the king reading about? Well, let's read on. Esther 6:2-3 says, it was found recorded there that Mordecai had exposed Bithagna and Teresh, two of the king's officials who guarded the doorway, who had conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. "What honor and recognition has Mordecai received for this?" the king asked. "Nothing has been done for him," his attendants answered. So what's fascinating here is that King Xerxes has been ruling for 12 years. And his attendants could have picked any one of the many volumes of the Book of Chronicles. And within that volume, the king could have read any story. But the one story he read was how Mordecai had foiled this assassination plot. Xerxes remembered it, but didn't know if Mordecai had been honored for foiling the plot. But the attendants said that he didn't. And this upset the king. He thought, well, Mordecai saved my life, so it would come across as ungrateful if I don't at least thank him. So let's read on and see what he decides to do. Verses 4 and 5 say, "The king said, 'Who is in the court?' Now Haman has just entered the outer court of the palace to speak to the king about impaling Mordecai on the pole he had set up for him. His attendants answered, 'Haman is standing in the court.' 'Bring him in,' the king ordered. So the next day, there's someone in the palace court, and it's Mr. Despicable himself, Haman. And Haman wanted to tell the king all about his plan to impale Mordecai on a pole. But before he can start talking about this, the king poses a question. He says in verse 6, "When Haman entered, the king asked him, 'What should be done for the man that the king delights to honor?'" Now the king doesn't actually say the name of this man, but we all know it to be Mordecai. But of course, egocentric Haman doesn't think that. He has another idea. Reading on. "Now Haman thought to himself, 'Who is there that the king would rather honor than me?' So he answered the king, 'For the man the king delights to honor, have him bring a royal robe the king has worn, and a horse the king has ridden, one with a royal crest placed on his head. Then let the robe and the horse be entrusted to one of the king's most noble princes. Let them robe the man the king delights to honor, and lead him on the horse through the city streets, proclaiming before him, 'This is what is done for the man the king delights to honor.'" So Haman thinks it's him that the king is talking about. And he comes up with something that would be celebratory and will pump up his own ego more and more. He says, "Give him a royal robe, give him a horse, give him a crown." So it's kind of like give him the designer clothes, pimp his ride, and give him some bling. Then let him parade along the streets with the stereo pumping. And the king likes this plan. But then comes the gut punch to Haman. The king says in verse 10, "Go at once," the king commanded Haman. "Get the robe and the horse and do just as you've suggested for Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. Do not neglect anything you have recommended." Now, Haman wasn't expecting this. And it must have hit him hard. And I think that we've all had times where things have hit us. We've thought that we deserve something, but it turns out that the honor is given to someone else. And we need to acknowledge other people's achievements and give them encouragement and not go sit in the corner and be miserable or plot against them. Well, Haman did not have the same reaction. Let's see what he says and done. Starting in verse 11. "So Haman got the robe and the horse. He robed Mordecai and led him on horseback through the city streets, proclaiming before him, 'This is what is done for the man the king delights to honor.' Afterward, Mordecai returned to the king's gate. But Haman rushed home with his head covered in grief and told Zeresh, his wife, and all his friends everything that had happened to him. His advisors and his wife Zeresh said to him, "Since Mordecai, before whom your downfall has started, is of Jewish origin, you cannot stand against him. You will surely come to ruin." While they were still talking with him, the king's eunuchs arrived and hurried Haman away to the banquet Esther had prepared. So Haman is compelled to do what the king has suggested. And he must have felt so knocked. He had to honor Mordecai. He must have hated every single minute of it. Well, going back to the beginning, when we think about it, the king could have had insomnia any night. He could have picked any volume of the Book of Chronicles. And within the volume, he could have picked any story. But he had insomnia that one night. He picked that one volume, and he picked that one story about Mordecai foiling the assassination attempt. And then it could have been at any random time that Haman showed up, but it was on that one day that he did. Is all this luck? Is it serendipity? Is it coincidence, just chance? I don't think so. As I said at the start, God is not explicitly mentioned in the book of Esther, but God's fingerprints are all over it. And none more so than what we've seen today, God shows up in the story, and God shows up in our story. God shows up in the small little details of our life. And as a believer in Jesus, I don't believe in luck or chance. I believe there's a providential God that goes before me and is weaving my story along with his. And this realization has really changed my life. And now I'm always looking for where God has intervened and where God has shown up and directed my path. But I always have to be on the lookout, and I always have to be receptive to it. Now, there was this radio comedy on the BBC, which is the British Broadcasting Corporation. There is nothing else in radio but the BBC, right? And my wife Susan and I would listen to this comedy every week. And it was about an airline crew. And one of the flight attendants was a bit of a lovable fool. And when he was on a long car journey, he would play a game called Yellow Car. Every time he saw a yellow car, he would shout, "Yellow car!" And this began to get on the nerves of the other people he was traveling with. So one of them asked him one day, "When does yellow car end?" And he said, "That's the beauty of yellow car. It never ends." Well, now Susan and I play yellow car all the time. We played yellow car coming here today. We play it on long car journeys. But we also play it just from driving from our home 3 minutes down the road to our local Starbucks. And whoever spots the most yellow cars is the winner. Now, it turns out that Susan is very good at yellow car. So I hardly ever win. But what you do realize is that there are more yellow cars on the road than you might think. But if you weren't playing yellow car, you wouldn't notice them. And the same is true for our lives. Unless we look for the small ways that God has touched and directed our lives, we might not notice them. That person that God puts into your life at that exact moment. That thing you feel prompted to do at that exact moment. It's the providential direction of an omnipotent God. And our story is intertwined with God's bigger story, God's bigger plans for humanity. And it's no coincidence that he uses us today. And we're all called to be part of his story. We're placed on this earth for such a time as this. And looking back, I can see how God has built me and prepared me for my purpose, and that nothing has happened to me in my life that was by accident. It's all intentional. I moved over here from the UK to take a position at the University of Connecticut, where I teach chemistry. But God didn't really call me to the US to teach chemistry. He called me to join Bill at a pivotal moment in the growth of the church, which was then Calvary Fellowship in West Hartford, Connecticut. And I truly believe he's continuing to use me in what is now the same church, but now called 180 Life. But it was thanks to Bill that I first really got involved in ministry. So I'm really so thankful for all that he, Rebecca, and the others did in my life. And what we find is that quite often what we have to do goes against the world's narrative. The world says you'll get recognition for whatever you do. But you don't always. Look at Haman. He thought that he deserved all the recognition. But it was Mordecai that had foiled the assassination attempt. It was Mordecai that deserved the recognition. But he just didn't get it. But the reality is that God's good for us is better than anything we could ever fathom. But sometimes we don't see it and we don't understand it. We want to see ahead and see the full story, see the full picture, the beginning, the middle, and the end. But we're in the thick of it, and it may not feel good at the time, but I promise God is pursuing your good. And the problem is that our version of good is not always God's version of good. We're in the midst of it all. We've lost a loved one. We've lost our job. We're facing what seem like unsurmountable challenges. But we don't just understand that God is in the midst of it. And if you're going through a trial right now, I don't have an easy answer as to why you're going through it. But I do know that one day it's going to make sense. The story, as I say, of how I got over to Connecticut is one of these things. I was working at a university in central London, but as you can imagine, it's actually quite expensive to have a chemistry department in London. Not only the cost of the chemicals and equipment, but also because it takes up a lot of space. And you need room for all the labs and things. Well, the university I was part of decided that chemistry was too expensive. And so they decided to close their chemistry department. And with that, I lost my job. And at the time, I didn't know why this happened to me or what to do. But now I see it was because God wanted me here in the USA. And I now see that God was weaving and is continuing to weave my story into his bigger story. And sometimes the good that God is working out doesn't feel too good, but he's working all things out. Let's look at things from the perspective of Haman. You know, he was so delusional. He just didn't see what was going on around him. There's this mighty God, but he doesn't know it. He doesn't have a relationship with him. He doesn't realize that God is orchestrating all these events and that he's not the main character. Haman is the most influential person outside of the king. He has wealth and fame, and people are bowing to him. But despite all of that, it wasn't enough for him. He devised his evil plans because one solitary guy wouldn't bow down before him. It was eating Haman alive that Mordecai wouldn't bow to him. And he was chasing the world's narrative of success. Haman just can't see how blessed his life really is. He can't see his own influence and wealth. He's so consumed with a narrative of pride and of self-worth, and he feels he's owed everything. And this is really a warning for us. We can so easily fall into this mindset. We feel like we're owed everything because that's our sin nature. But in reality, because of our sin, we're owed nothing. Yet we're given everything through Jesus. Despite our unworthiness, Jesus makes us worthy. But just as Proverbs 16 says in verse 18, pride goes before destruction, or haughty spirit before a fall. And Haman thought he was so clever, setting himself up for recognition and honor. And he was prideful, and he was haughty. Now, haughty is not a word we use much these days. Ultimately, it just means sheer arrogance. Haman was prideful and arrogant. And arrogance is birthed from not believing or realizing that God's in control of everything. It's like thinking I'm in charge of my own destiny. But pride and arrogance are so addictive. But what Haman didn't realize was that ultimately he was orchestrating his own doom. It starts when the king tells him to put on the show for Mordecai. Haman's inner narrative world imploded. Well, we can learn from Haman's mistakes. We need to be careful not to fall into the trap of pride. We need to remember that we are children of the Most High God, and it's to God that we are dependent. And our worth has been bought by the precious blood of Jesus. So we need to recognize that, but not at the same time puff ourselves up. In essence, we need to think about ourselves less and think less about ourselves. So we really have two narratives in this story we've seen today. We've seen Haman. When he looks out, he looks in the mirror. All he can see is his reflection in the mirror. He sees himself. And we have Mordecai, who when he looks out, he sees through a window. He sees the significance of what he's doing. He sees the bigger picture of God's handiwork, and he sees other people. So what about you? Are you holding up a mirror? Are you buying into the narrative of the world? Or are you looking out of the window, seeing beyond yourself? Looking out of the window is really foreign to Haman, and it can be for us. Putting others ahead of ourselves is a vastly different narrative to that the world gives us. And the result is a vastly different story. But it's a narrative that not only opens us up to God's divine plan for our life, but it brings us real satisfaction. Gazing in the mirror might seem nice, but in time we just feel empty. But there's a bigger reason in our lives, and that's why we need to look out of the window. It's because Jesus did it. Jesus put put us ahead of himself. And he did this to the point of dying on a cross for us, taking sin on himself and breaking the power of death and sin in our lives. And we're called to love and live like Jesus. So we need to be window people and not mirror gazers. And throughout this chapter in the book of Esther, we've seen God at work in small ways, but each of them being significant. And that's what God does in our life too. God is constantly building us and transforming us, equipping us to live our purpose. Nothing happens by accident. It's all intentional. So as we close, I want to encourage you to do two things this week. First, take stock of your motives and your mindset. Are you looking in the mirror and focusing on yourself? Or are you looking out of the window, putting others ahead of yourself? And second, I want you to play yellow car this week. Well, metaphorically. I don't want you to go and count all the yellow cars you see, although the number might actually surprise you. We've noticed there are more yellow cars in Florida than there are in Connecticut, so Susan can up her total even more. But what I mean is take a few minutes each day to reflect on how God has weaved your story into his bigger story. What God has done in your life that at first glance looks like luck or coincidence or chance, but when you reflect on it, you see it was God's providential hand touching your life. And every day this week, I encourage you to be on the lookout for where God is at work in your life. Don't just go through life with tunnel vision. Be on the lookout for God's hand. And I promise you'll see it. So as we go from here, if you've accepted Jesus into your heart, your story has been redeemed. But perhaps over time you've put God as a sort of footnote. You're not seeing how your story is intertwined with God's story. Well, I encourage you to look for God in the everyday. And make sure you have God at the center of your narrative where he belongs. And for those of you who don't yet have a relationship with Jesus, the first thing I want to say is that I'm incredibly grateful that you've come here today. And I want to tell you that just like God is in the details of the story that we looked at today, he's in the details of your life too. You're not here by accident. I truly believe that you're here this morning for a reason, and that reason is that you too can have your story changed forever through Jesus. And I want to encourage you to take the step to transform your story. We all buy in to the narrative of the world, but deep down, we're not satisfied. And I want to encourage you to change your narrative into the new story, the story of Jesus. Jesus came to this earth, fully man, fully God. He lived a perfect life and became the perfect sacrifice for you and for me. He died on a cross for our wrongdoing. And then he rose again from the dead 3 days later, breaking the power of death and sin in our lives. And our story's changed forever. And your story can change forever today too, by committing yourself to Jesus. And if you want to take that step today, I encourage you just to say these simple words in your heart. Jesus, I want to change my story today. I want to accept you into my life. Forgive me of the things I've done wrong and for the worldly narrative I've been living. I want my narrative to change so that I'm in your bigger story. Today I put my life in your hands. Guide me, direct me, and show me the love that you have for me. I ask this in the name of Jesus. So for all of us, let's go from here today knowing that God is in the details. And let's look for that in our lives. Let's be window people and not mirror gazers. And let's go find some yellow cars